Finally, I've been able to take the Sony A7S III traveling. I packed my bags and I went to Utah to meet up with my buddy Kyler Holland. And he's actually making a whole series on our trip together in Utah. And we actually met up with another guy who's a professional slackliner, and his name is Ben Schneider, also known as Reckless Ben. So if you haven't already, check out the first part of Kyler's series. Click on that card right there. And during this whole entire trip in Utah, which only lasted about 3 days, I was shooting primarily on the Sony A7S III. I brought a few lenses with me, the 16-35 Zeiss f4, the 24-70 Zeiss f4, and of course the 70-200 G Master. Now the 16-35 lens I actually used only once, but when I did, the shots did come out fantastic. My main shooter was with the 24-70 f4 Zeiss, and that's actually a very cheap lens that a lot of people are buying, and I highly recommend it. And even though it's an f4 lens, with the Sony A7S III, you are going to get phenomenal low light footage. Even during the day, I loved using the 24-70. Now overall, if you take a look at the Sony A7S III footage, I did shoot 80% of my footage in low light. And believe it or not, being at S-Log3 at 640 base ISO and using an ND filter, the footage was still very well lit at 6 p.m., which was just after sunset when I was hiking in the mountains with Kyler. This camera is extremely sensitive in low light, even at its base ISO. Now I pushed this camera all the way up to 25,600 ISO at f4, and you can see how there is very minimal grain or noise. And if you do see any of that noise, it's well managed. Now when I got back to LA, I looked over the footage. Obviously I was impressed with the sensitivity and when it came down to the color grading. But now that I've used my Zeiss f4 for years, I think it's time to upgrade to a 2.8. But instead of going for the G Master, I decided to shell out for the 24-70 Sigma Art 2.8. I was messing around with Kyler's 85 1.4 Sigma, and we were using his Canon 5D Mark IV, and the images came out phenomenal. So if you haven't already messed around with Sigma Art lenses, I do strongly suggest checking it out. I'm very excited to be using a Sigma Art for video finally, and you'll see some test footage with that lens as soon as I get it. So did I have any major issues with the Sony A7S III during my trip? No, zero. Absolutely zero issues, especially when it came down to its battery life, its overall ergonomics, the ease of use. I thought it was phenomenal. I'll be honest, I'm still struggling with locating things in the menu, specific settings, and so on and so forth, but that's because I'm more familiar with the older Sony settings. It is also kind of frustrating that I don't have any of Sony's A-mount CF Express cards, because I am slightly limited when it comes down to the recording frame rates and bit rates, especially when it comes down to the slow motion. However, with the Lexar SD card, I'm able to shoot 120 at 422 10-bit at 280 megabits per second. So I am pretty happy about that. But as soon as I get that Sony CF Express Tough card, oh man, my hard drives are just gonna fill up extremely fast. Now it is important, and I did mention this in my previous video, that you do get the right SD cards or memory cards in general for this camera, because the bit rates are so high. The slowest cards in my opinion that you should be using are those Lexar 2000X cards, even though you can use the slower cards, but the 2000X is the most versatile throughout all the frame rates and the bit rates with the Sony A7S III. Now shooting during daylight, I did slightly overexpose my footage by actually 2 stops when shooting in S-Log3, and obviously I was able to recover a lot of my highlights. I mean, the data held up really well, especially in the slow motion, where I didn't notice any chromatic aberrations or unnecessary noise. The footage came out extremely crispy. Now, one thing I was extremely happy that I brought with me on my Utah trip was my gimbal, because the slow motion paired with the gimbal created buttery shots, especially if you shoot a lot of action sports. And the 16mm lens that I brought, I wish I shot more with it because that wide angle is absolutely gorgeous. So if you're a beginner with Sony equipment, I do suggest the Sony A7S III obviously, and you start off with a 16-35 f4 and just their whole f4 Zeiss lineup. I think it's a phenomenal beginner to prosumer lens combo, and I've been using them for years. I'm now starting to upgrade my lenses to 2.8. I've had my 70-200 G Master for a pretty long while, and the 70-200 G Master 2.8 lens I've been using mainly for the interview bits that we shot for Kyler's series. And all we used for the lighting was a pocket LED light that I mounted on a selfie stick, and we used a tiny little edge light that we put in the back. The A7S III did the rest of the work, and you can see how well it performed in low light. Even the shadows show very minimal grain. Now there was this place in Salt Lake City, the flatbeds. It's literally just dried up lake beds that are covered in salt. This was the most bizarre place, one of the most bizarre places that I shot. And of course I was shooting an S-Log3, and you can see how well the Sony A7S III is performing. This location was extremely desaturated. Very mild colors, mainly grays and whites and slight tints of blue. But this allows you to boost those colors in post if you want that type of look. As for me, this was kind of like a post-apocalyptic type of area, and I really loved the desaturated colors that I got straight out of the camera. I did tweak the colors a little bit, but here you can see how well S-Log3 is performing. Now for those of you who don't know, S-Log3 is a little bit strange when it comes down to dialing ISOs. Check out this video right here if you don't know what I'm talking about. But basically, we get noisy footage at certain ISOs, and then as soon as you reach another ISO, it just completely resets and the noise disappears. This is different for each color profile or picture profile in the Sony A7S III. But I got used to using S-Log3 so much that I just put on an ND filter, and whenever I needed to boost up my ISO, I just smacked on that ND filter on my lens, and that took care of all of my issues. But I tried to shoot all of my videos in Utah using S-Log3, and those ND filters definitely helped out. And I also did a review on some of the best ND filters for your camera, so you can check out that video right here. But currently I am using the Polar Pro ND filters, and they held up really well in Utah. And of course, I didn't reach any overheating issues. One battery would last me 4 to 5 hours. I honestly have 5 battery packs, and that lasted me the whole weekend in Utah. And I also have these aftermarket batteries for my Sony A7S III from a company called Each Shot. They perform really well, actually just as good as the original Sony batteries, but they're about half the price. So I'll link them down below if you're interested. They saved me a lot of money, and I have 2 of these, and then I have 3 original Sony batteries. Overall, this camera performed to my expectations. When it came down to low light, it outperformed my expectations, especially since I'm coming from the original Sony A7S. So if you are on the edge, if you are on the fence of whether or not you should get this camera, I'll tell you right now that this is the best hybrid camera on the market, especially paired with my soon to come Sigma art lens. I'm so excited for it. I'll let you know what the footage looks like as soon as I get it, but I came from Canon about 5 or 6 years ago. Now I'm Sony. I was debating whether or not I wanted to switch over back to Canon because of the R5, but I'm glad I didn't, because this is truly the beast of all beasts when it comes down to hybrid shooting. So if you're interested about any of the gear that I talked about in today's video, check out the links down below. And also, if you enjoyed yourself, give this video a big like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.